Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. This week, China opens up its airwaves to report a disaster.
We have been bringing you the latest news and information on China's all-out search, rescue and relief efforts.
Learning the lessons of history live on TV.
It all goes back to appeasement.
No, what did he do? Tell me what he did.
It's the key term.
The computer gamers of South Korea, the closest thing to rock stars, and losing the plot.
Do it live! I'll write it and we'll do it live!
An American broadcaster has a hissy fit for the ages. Welcome back. China has seen natural disasters before, but one of the things that set the earthquake in Sichuan province apart is that 1 billion-plus Chinese citizens, as well as the outside world, were able to follow the story on television. It was the first time in the country's history that the media were given freedom, relatively speaking, to report on this kind of story. Here's the question. Are we witnessing a sea change in what the Chinese government is willing to tolerate from the media? Or are these media reforms just temporary, more to do with the upcoming Beijing Olympics than a change in policy? That's our starting point this week, the earthquake and how the media and China's rulers have handled it. When the earth shook and the news broke, the media had a huge and complex story on their hands.
Foreign media have been paying close attention to the latest earthquake developments.
The global media didn't just cover the earthquake story, they reported on how China's media covered it.
We've been watching the coverage of the rescue effort all week long. And so have the Chinese on their own airwaves, and that has become part of this story.
The Chinese coverage has been absolute blanket coverage on nearly every single channel in China, and there are 100 or more of them.
It's actually very interesting because we can't say that the coverage is restricted. Most probably what the government is trying to show is that they can fully handle the situation.
Compare the coverage to that of the last major quake to hit China in 1976.
If you look at 1976, the earthquake happened in Tangshan and killed 250,000 in one night. The whole city flattened. And Chinese government didn't say how many people, didn't report it. And 3 years later, they reveal the number. It's 250,000. But lots of people suspect it's much higher than that.
I think in the modern era, that's very difficult to hide. But I don't think the Chinese government is trying to hide it. To be fair to them, they have done a very good job here.
I think the question so often in China is compared to what? Compared to 30 years ago, the Tangshan earthquake in 1976, complete openness almost in the way that this is being covered. Does that mean there's complete openness in the media on everything in China? Absolutely not, compared with Western press freedoms.
Cases in point?
We can't move any further up this road because they've stopped us going further. They're allowing Chinese journalists into the area, but they're not allowing foreign journalists into the area.
Behind us is Beichuan past the mountains, but police won't let us film. And as you can see, they're trying to take the camera off of us right now, physically, by force. They won't let us film tens of thousands.
But for the most part, foreign journalists were pleasantly surprised by the access they were given.
I'm standing in front of the remains of a hospital in Dujiangyan. 100 people still feared trapped in the rubble.
Although China has said it was loosening the rules for media as the Beijing Games approach, the reforms are selectively applied. The government reverted to its past form when the Olympic torch relay was targeted by demonstrators after violent protests had erupted in Tibet. In both cases, Beijing tried to control domestic and foreign news coverage or restricted it.
Tibet was a public relations disaster. And the Chinese government wasn't ready for it, didn't realize it was going to happen, and showed itself quite unable to cope, really, with it. The policymakers and media handlers must have sat down afterwards and said, this is a disaster. What are we going to do? How are we going to improve our image?
When the Tibet story happened, we were immediately isolated and cut off. There were roadblocks everywhere we went. This has been very different. If they'd done that this time, they would have hindered the rescue operation. So I think that's one of the reasons why they didn't do it. At the same time, I think they've been very keen to see the story told at a time when China hasn't had very good publicity this year.
Traditional Chinese way of thinking is we think face is very important. So the torch tour things makes Chinese government, also Chinese people, feel very embarrassed. Actually, we didn't understand what's the rules outside. We're probably knowing what's going on inside China, but once the tour goes out, and then when some people protest, which is quite normal, happened in Western countries, the Chinese government thinks it's a big humiliation.
Unlike the torch or Tibet stories, the earthquake gave the Chinese government a chance to show its people and the world its compassionate side.
Prime Minister Wen Jiabao is a very remarkable communicator. He stands out among the Chinese leadership as somebody who understands the modern media. Wen Jiabao seems to be particularly sophisticated and particularly able to reassure people by his presence.
I do think Prime Minister Wen Jiabao's tears are sincere and genuine. I don't think that's a PR things. But I think they're getting better PR concept now.
Why? Because the Chinese government can show itself open and sympathetic to the needs of Western journalists for information. They can demand sympathy for a terrible crisis they're struggling with.
More than 100 children remain unaccounted for.
The story the Chinese are allowing to be told is not just for foreign eyes. There is the domestic audience, the world's biggest, at more than 1.3 billion people.
因为我们爱这个土地，这个土地上的人们懂得相互关怀。
I think it shows how much the Chinese government relies upon the public. And they do use the media to that extent. Nonetheless, I don't think they're trying to spin the global media for publicity. I think they're giving access because they want people to know the terrible thing that's really happened here.
They become more human. So that's something I feel very impressed, and I feel very proud about the media change, also about the change of China.
I don't think we should be under any illusions that just because they have opened up the coverage for this earthquake, that necessarily means that media coverage, whether within China or access for foreign media in future, is just going to be open across the board, because clearly it's not.
So far in 2008, there's been Tibet, the torch, the earthquake, and the games are still to come. China is one of the world's biggest stories. Watch this media space.
Our Global Village Voices now with their take on China and the media.
However, in China, they're actually using this opportunity to tell people that, outside people in particular, that they care about the people. Especially, I think, it's after the Tibet issue, where they lost a lot of Western media support. Right now, with this Chinese disaster, of course, I won't say that Chinese government really want to make it just a publicity issue, but they know that this time they must do something good to their people and also good to the Western media.
From a PR perspective, the earthquake was a blessing in disguise, an opportunity to distract attention from sensitive human rights issues. But the media coverage from the earthquake is also tightly controlled by the Communist Party. For instance, there is no coverage of the effect of the earthquake on Tibetan areas of Sichuan. Real freedom of the press means to allow independent journalists to uncover the whole story.
If you'd like to add your voice to the mix of media critics we have here on the broadcast, email us at listeningpost@aljazeera.net and we'll find a way to get you on the air as one of our Global Village Voices. This week's News Bite segment begins with apologies from two well-known media outlets, both of which used the wrong picture to tell different stories. The British Broadcasting Corporation has admitted it messed up when it aired these images that it said were of casualties of the Myanmar cyclone taken in the Irrawaddy Delta. The pictures were in fact of Sumatra following the tsunami that devastated Southeast Asia in 2004. The BBC has apologized unreservedly for using the misleading images, says it's reviewing its editorial policies to ensure it doesn't happen again. At least the BBC can say it was dealing with a breaking news story. The French paper Le Monde can offer no such explanation following the publication of pictures that it said were of the Hiroshima bomb aftermath in 1945. The paper devoted a full page to a report entitled Hiroshima, What the World Never Saw. The reason the world never saw these pictures in relation to Hiroshima is that they were of an earthquake near Tokyo from 1923. The pictures immediately ignited anti-American sentiment throughout cyberspace as parallels were drawn with Vietnam and Iraq. Le Monde was somewhat less contrite than the BBC, attempting to shift some of the blame onto the Hoover Institute, where the photographs had been placed in an archive before the paper published them. Still with France, the country's blanket legal protection of journalistic sources may soon be a thing of the past. The Sarkozy government has introduced legislation that would force journalists to reveal their sources when, quote, a pressing imperative requires it, unquote. France's Justice Minister Rachida Dati argues that journalists must, in certain cases, recognize the needs of law enforcers. Journalists who oppose the law say the wording is far too ambiguous. They also argue that it would have particular implications for investigative reporters covering terrorism and security affairs. In an important story that got little media coverage, probably because it affects the media, the U.S. Senate has voted to block a legal change that would have allowed companies that own television stations to also buy newspapers in the same markets. Late last year, the U.S. broadcast regulator, the Federal Communication Commission, ruled that media companies should be able to own multiple outlets in the same city. Media consumer groups fought against the changes. They say the media in the U.S. are already in the hands of too few owners, and that represents a threat to a free press and democracy. The lion's share of U.S. media is controlled by 6 major corporations: Disney, Viacom, Time Warner, News Corp, Bertelsmann AG, and General Electric. And here's a fun one.
Let me ask you, what did Chamberlain do wrong, Neville Chamberlain do wrong in 1939? What did he do wrong?
It all goes back to appeasement.
No, what did he do? Tell me what he did.
It's the key term.
You have to answer this question.
That question was asked 19 times by Chris Matthews of the U.S. news network MSNBC during a now infamous interview that aired last week. The episode followed a speech President George Bush made in Israel in which he suggested that anyone who advocates negotiating with Iran is guilty of appeasement, like British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain's dealings with Adolf Hitler in 1938. Matthews' guest, right-wing talk radio host Kevin James, agreed with Bush, although he didn't seem quite sure about what it was he was agreeing with.
His actions enabled, energized, legitimized. It's the exact same.
I'm not going to continue with this interview unless you answer what that thing is. What did Chamberlain do in 39? Tell me.
Chris, it's the exact same thing, all right?
Okay, I've been sitting here for 5 minutes asking you to say what the president was referring to in 1938 at Munich.
I don't know.
You don't know. Thank you.
Matthews' point, a lot of talk radio hosts should talk less and read more. We're back after the break with a story about computer gamers in South Korea who've turned professional.